Hey there, and welcome to After Dark Horrors. I'm here to help you unwind tonight. Before you get too comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe. Only if you really enjoy what I'm doing here. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. It's always cool to see how connected we all are. I think you'll enjoy these stories. Honestly, there's something you won't find anywhere else. So dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that background hum, and let's get started. There's something unsettling about mausoleums. These stone monuments to the dead stand like silent sentinels in our cemeteries, their marble walls holding secrets that most of us would rather not think about. But for those who work around them, groundskeepers, funeral directors, and security guards, these structures sometimes reveal mysteries that challenge everything we think we know about death and what comes after. Tonight, I want to share 5 true encounters that happened in and around mausoleums across America. These aren't tales of obvious supernatural events, but rather subtle moments when reality seemed to shift, leaving witnesses questioning what they had actually experienced. Each story comes from someone who found themselves alone with these monuments to the dead, only to discover that solitude isn't always guaranteed. Story 1. The night watchman, Marcus Chen, had been working security at Woodlawn Cemetery in Detroit for 3 years when he first noticed the inconsistencies. The job paid well for night work, and Marcus appreciated the peace that came with patrolling the grounds after dark. Most nights, his biggest concern was teenagers trying to sneak in on dares or the occasional vandal with too much time and too little sense. The Whitmore Mausoleum sat at the center of the cemetery, an imposing marble structure built in 1924 for one of Detroit's old automotive families. It was the size of a small chapel with stained glass windows and heavy bronze doors that had been sealed for decades. Marcus's route took him past it every hour, and he'd grown comfortable with its presence. Until that October evening, when things began to change. It was around 2 a.m. when Marcus first noticed the light, a soft, warm glow emanating from inside the mausoleum, barely visible through the colored glass windows. He stopped his patrol cart and stared, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The structure had no electrical connections. It had been sealed and abandoned for maintenance issues years before Marcus started working there. Marcus parked his cart and approached the mausoleum on foot. The light was definitely coming from inside, casting faint patterns through the stained glass onto the grass outside. He walked around the entire structure, checking for any signs of forced entry. The bronze doors remained sealed, their locks undisturbed. The windows were too high and too narrow for anyone to squeeze through. He called his supervisor, Frank, who lived 20 minutes away. "There's a light inside the Whitmore Mausoleum," Marcus reported, feeling foolish as he said it. "Looks like someone's got candles or something in there." Frank sighed through the phone. "Marcus, that place has been sealed tight for 15 years. You sure you're not seeing a reflection from the streetlights?" Marcus looked around. The nearest streetlight was blocked by 3 rows of monuments. "I'm standing right in front of it, Frank. There's definitely a light source inside." "All right, I'll be there in 20. Don't go inside. We'll need bolt cutters if we're going to check it out." Marcus waited, keeping his eyes on the windows. The light remained steady, occasionally flickering as if someone was moving around inside. When Frank arrived with his toolkit and a second security guard named Tony, the 3 men approached the mausoleum together. "I'll be damned," Frank muttered, staring up at the glowing windows. "Tony, you ever seen anything like this?" Tony shook his head, pulling out his flashlight. 30 years I've been doing this job. Never seen a sealed building light itself up." Frank cut through the chains on the bronze doors with heavy-duty bolt cutters. The metal links fell to the ground with a sharp clatter that echoed across the cemetery. As the door swung open, Marcus felt a rush of stale air that carried the scent of old flowers and something else, something sweet and cloying that made his throat tight. The interior of the mausoleum was empty, completely empty. The light that had been glowing for over 30 minutes was gone, leaving them staring into darkness that their flashlights could barely penetrate. The marble walls were covered in a thin layer of dust, undisturbed. No footprints on the floor, no signs that anyone had been inside. But there were flowers, fresh flowers, white lilies arranged in glass vases on the marble shelves where the deceased family members rested. The flowers were perfect, as if they had just been delivered from a florist. Water droplets still clung to the petals. "Who the hell brought these in here?" Frank whispered, his voice carrying an edge of unease. Marcus examined the flowers more closely. They were arranged with professional skill, each stem cut to the perfect length, each blossom positioned for maximum visual impact. "These aren't old flowers, Frank. These were placed recently. Today, maybe." The three men searched the mausoleum thoroughly. They found no hidden entrances, no loose stones, no way someone could have entered without coming through the bronze doors they had just cut open. The windows were solid, unbroken, and designed only to let light in, not to provide access. Maybe maintenance came by earlier, Tony suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. Could have been doing some kind of restoration work. Frank pulled out his phone and called the cemetery office's after-hours line. After several transfers, he reached the night supervisor for the grounds crew. No one had been inside the Whitmore Mausoleum. No work had been scheduled. No one had authorization to enter the sealed structure. Marcus took photos of the flower arrangements with his phone. As he did, he noticed something else that made his skin prickle. The dust on the marble shelves had been recently disturbed, but not in the way it would be if someone had simply placed flowers there. Instead, the dust patterns looked as if the flowers had materialized in place. Pushing the dust aside by their very presence, Frank decided to reseal the mausoleum and file a report in the morning. As they prepared to leave, Marcus took one last look inside. The emptiness felt different now, expectant somehow, as if something was waiting for them to leave so it could continue whatever it had been doing. Over the following weeks, Marcus began paying closer attention to the Whitmore Mausoleum during his rounds. The light never appeared again, but other changes became apparent. Fresh flowers continued to appear inside, despite the doors being sealed with new, heavier chains. The arrangements changed weekly. All was white flowers, all was perfectly maintained. Marcus started documenting the phenomenon with his phone camera. He photographed the sealed doors, the new flower arrangements visible through the windows, the complete lack of any disturbance around the structure. When he showed the photos to Frank, his supervisor just shook his head. "Look, Marcus, I don't know what to tell you. Could be the family has some arrangement we don't know about. Could be the grounds crew is playing a prank. All I know is nobody's reporting any damage, and the families aren't complaining about unauthorized access." But Marcus knew it was more than that. The flowers weren't just appearing, they were being tended. He began to notice subtle changes in their arrangements, as if someone was adjusting them, ensuring they looked their best. Water levels in the vases remained constant, despite no visible maintenance. The situation escalated one November evening when Marcus arrived for his shift to find the bronze doors standing open. Not forced open, not damaged, but simply ajar, as if someone had politely stepped outside and forgotten to close them behind themselves. Marcus called Frank immediately, but his supervisor was at his daughter's school play and couldn't come until later. Tony was covering another section of the cemetery that night. Marcus found himself alone with the open mausoleum, protocol demanding that he investigate, but instinct telling him to wait for backup. Against his better judgment, Marcus approached the open doors, The interior was lit again, that same warm glow he had seen weeks earlier. This time he could see the source of the light. Candles, dozens of white candles placed throughout the mausoleum, their flames steady despite the cold November breeze that should have extinguished them. Marcus called out, "Hello, is someone in there?" "This is cemetery security," no response. The candles continued to burn, their light dancing across the marble walls. Marcus stepped inside, his flashlight ready, though the candlelight made it unnecessary. The mausoleum felt warm despite the cold night outside, and that sweet, cloying scent was stronger now. The flower arrangements had changed again. Instead of white lilies, the vases now held white roses, baby's breath, and what looked like orchids. The arrangements were even more elaborate than before, cascading from the marble shelves in elegant displays that would have cost hundreds of dollars from a professional florist. As Marcus examined the flowers, he heard something that made him freeze. Footsteps, soft, deliberate footsteps coming from deeper within the mausoleum. But the structure wasn't that deep. He could see the entire interior from where he stood. "Hello," he called again, his voice less steady now. "I need you to identify yourself and explain how you got in here." The footsteps stopped. The candles continued to burn in perfect stillness. Marcus waited, counting seconds, listening for any sound that might explain what he had heard. Nothing. He began backing toward the open doors, keeping his eyes on the interior of the mausoleum. As he reached the threshold, all the candles went out simultaneously, not blown out by wind, not guttering down to their wicks, but extinguished in a single instant, as if someone had thrown a switch. Marcus ran to his security cart and drove to the main office, where he called Frank and demanded an immediate meeting with cemetery management. By the time Frank arrived with the cemetery director, the mausoleum doors were closed and sealed again, the chains intact. No candles, no unusual light, no signs of recent entry. But the flowers remained, visible through the stained glass windows, more beautiful and perfect than ever. Marcus quit his job the following week. In his resignation letter, he wrote only that he had found a position better suited to his needs. He never told anyone except his wife about the candles or the footsteps or the feeling that something in that mausoleum had been watching him, waiting for him to understand that some places hold more than just the dead. Story 2. The restoration project Elena Rodriguez had been working as a historic preservation specialist for 12 years when she was hired to assess the condition of the Ashford family mausoleum in Riverside Cemetery, California. The project seemed straightforward. Evaluate the structural integrity of the 1890s-era building and recommend necessary repairs to prevent further deterioration. The mausoleum was a Gothic revival masterpiece, built from Indiana limestone, with intricate carvings and iron details that had survived over a century of California weather. The Ashford family had made their fortune in railroads and had spared no expense in creating their eternal resting place. Elena had worked on similar projects before, and this one appealed to her both professionally and aesthetically. What she hadn't expected was how the building would affect her personally. Elena's first visit to the mausoleum was on a bright Tuesday morning in March. She arrived with her equipment: cameras, measuring tools, moisture detectors, and a tablet for recording her observations. The cemetery groundskeeper, an elderly man named Sam, unlocked the iron gates and heavy wooden doors for her. "Haven't had anyone inside for maybe 10 years, Sam mentioned as he struggled with the old lock. "Family stopped visiting regular-like, and we only open it for the annual cleaning. You'll probably find it pretty dusty in there." The interior of the mausoleum was larger than Elena had expected, with vaulted ceilings and stained glass windows that cast colorful patterns across the marble floor. 6 crypts lined the walls, each marked with brass plaques bearing the names and dates of the Ashford family members. The space felt more like a small church than a tomb, with wooden pews facing an altar-like area where the oldest crypts were located. Elena began her assessment methodically, photographing every angle, testing the mortar between stones, checking for water damage and structural weakness. The building was in remarkably good condition for its age. The limestone had weathered gracefully, and the ironwork showed only minor rust that could be easily treated. As she worked, Elena became aware of the exceptional acoustics in the space. Every sound she made, footsteps, the click of her camera, the scratch of her pen on paper, seemed to echo and linger. It created an almost musical quality to her movements, as if the mausoleum itself was composing a subtle symphony from the sounds of her work. After 3 hours of initial assessment, Elena had covered about half the interior. She was measuring the thickness of the walls when she noticed something that made her pause. Near one of the crypts, the dust patterns on the floor appeared to have been disturbed recently, not in a random way that might suggest settling or air circulation, but in distinct patterns that looked almost like footprints. Elena knelt down for a closer examination. The disturbances were subtle, but definitely present. Oval shapes in the dust that suggested someone had been walking in that area. But Sam had told her no one had been inside for months, and she was the first person to enter that day. She photographed the dust patterns and continued her work, making a mental note to ask Sam about any recent maintenance or cleaning that might explain the disturbance. As the afternoon wore on, Elena found herself increasingly absorbed in the beauty of the mausoleum's craftsmanship. Every detail had been executed with precision and artistry. The stone carving around the crypts featured intricate floral motifs, and the stained glass windows depicted scenes of natural beauty rather than religious imagery. It was while she was photographing one of these windows that Elena first heard the music. It was faint at first, barely audible above the ambient sounds of the cemetery outside. A melody that seemed to drift through the air like fragrance, coming from no identifiable source but filling the space with its presence. Elena stopped what she was doing and listened carefully. The music was classical, something that sounded like a string quartet, performed with remarkable skill and emotion. Elena walked toward the front of the mausoleum, thinking the sound might be coming from outside, perhaps a memorial service or some kind of cemetery event. But as she moved closer to the doors, the music seemed to fade. When she returned to the area where she had been working, it grew stronger again. She spent 20 minutes trying to locate the source of the music, checking every corner of the mausoleum, looking for speakers or sound equipment that might have been installed without her knowledge. She found nothing. The music continued, beautiful and haunting, apparently emanating from the walls themselves. Elena decided to record the phenomenon with her phone. As she held the device up and activated the recording function, the music stopped abruptly. She waited several minutes, but it didn't resume. When she played back her recording, it contained only the ambient sounds she would have expected: distant traffic, wind in the trees, the settling sounds of an old building. She finished her works for the day and left the mausoleum, promising Sam she would return the next morning to complete her assessment. That evening, Elena found herself thinking about the music she had heard. She was familiar with auditory illusions that could occur in spaces with unusual acoustics, but this had felt different. The music had been too clear, too structured, too beautiful to be a random acoustic phenomenon. Eleanor returned the next morning with additional equipment, including a digital audio recorder that she hoped might capture whatever she had heard the day before. Sam unlocked the mausoleum again, mentioning that he had noticed the iron gates standing slightly ajar when he arrived that morning. "Well, I thought maybe you'd come back early," he said, "but your car wasn't here." Elena assured him she hadn't returned after leaving the previous afternoon. Sam shrugged and attributed it to wind or settling, though Elena noticed the gates were heavy and would require significant force to move. Inside the mausoleum, Elena immediately noticed that the dust patterns she had photographed the day before had changed. The subtle footprint shapes she had documented were gone, but new ones had appeared in different locations. It was as if someone had been walking through the space during the night, their movements creating new disturbances in the accumulated dust. Elena set up her audio recorder and continued her assessment work. Within an hour, the music began again. This time, she was ready for it. The melody was different from what she had heard the day before. A piano piece that she recognized as Chopin, performed with a level of skill that suggested professional training. The recorder was capturing everything. Elena felt a mixture of excitement and unease as she documented this unexplained phenomenon. She took photographs of the new dust patterns, measured the areas where the music seemed strongest, and noted correlations between the acoustic hotspots and the locations of the crypts. As the morning progressed, Elena began to feel as though she was not alone in the mausoleum. It wasn't a threatening presence, more like the awareness that someone was nearby, just outside her field of vision. She found herself glancing over her shoulder frequently, expecting to see another person who was never there. The feeling grew stronger as she worked near the oldest crypts, those dating back to the 1890s. Elena consulted her historical research notes and discovered that one of the crypts contained the remains of Margaret Ashford, who had been an accomplished pianist before her death at age 32 in 1897. Another held Henry Ashford, a violinist who had studied in Vienna and performed with local orchestras before his death in 1903. Elena began to suspect she was experiencing some kind of residual energy from the deceased family members, particularly those who had been musicians. She had heard theories about places retaining impressions of significant events or strong emotions, and the mausoleum certainly qualified as a space where powerful feelings of loss and remembrance had been concentrated over many decades. By afternoon, Elena had completed her structural assessment. The mausoleum was in excellent condition, requiring only minor repairs to the mortar and routine maintenance of the ironwork. But she found herself reluctant to leave. The music had continued throughout the day, shifting between different pieces and instruments, always beautiful, always just beyond normal explanation. As Elena packed her equipment, she made a decision that surprised her. She asked Sam if she could have one additional day inside the mausoleum to complete some supplementary measurements. In truth, she wanted more time to document and understand the musical phenomena she had been experiencing. Sam agreed, and Elena spent a third day in the Ashford Mausoleum. This time, she brought flowers, white roses that she placed near the crypts of Margaret and Henry Ashford. She wasn't sure why she felt compelled to do this, but it seemed appropriate somehow. The music began almost immediately after she placed the flowers. But now it was different, not just piano or violin, but what sounded like a full quartet, the instruments weaving together in harmonies that brought tears to Elena's eyes. She sat in one of the wooden pews and listened, feeling as though she was being given a private concert by musicians who had been waiting over a century for an appreciative audience. When the music ended, Elena felt a sense of completion that she had never experienced on a restoration project before. She gathered her equipment and prepared to leave, but as she reached the doors, she turned back one final time. The mausoleum felt different now, not empty but peaceful, as if something that had been waiting had finally been acknowledged. Elena submitted her report recommending minimal restoration work, but she also included a suggestion that the cemetery consider hosting occasional musical performances in the mausoleum. She didn't explain her reasoning in the official report, but she hoped that somehow the space would once again be filled with the live music that seemed to be such an integral part of its character. 6 months later, Elena learned that the cemetery had indeed begun hosting small classical music recitals in the Ashford Mausoleum. The acoustics, they said, were absolutely exceptional. Story 3, the photographer's discovery, James. Wright had been photographing cemeteries for his art project, Monuments to Memory, for over 2 years when he first encountered the Blackwood family mausoleum in Graceland Cemetery, Chicago. His work focused on the architectural beauty of funerary art and the way different eras expressed their relationship with death through design and craftsmanship. The Blackwood Mausoleum was a perfect example of 1920s Art Deco funeral architecture, with clean lines, geometric patterns, and stylized bronze doors that had weathered to a beautiful patina. James had been granted special permission by the cemetery administration to photograph inside selected mausoleums as part of his artistic documentation project. James arrived early on a foggy October morning, his camera equipment loaded in a wheeled case that he pulled carefully along the cemetery's winding paths. The fog created an ethereal atmosphere that would provide perfect lighting for the kind of moody, contemplative photographs he was known for. The cemetery supervisor, Mrs. Patterson, met him at the mausoleum with the keys. She was a woman in her 60s who had worked at Graceland for over 20 years and took pride in maintaining the historic burial grounds. The Blackwood family were prominent in the construction business, she explained as she unlocked the bronze doors. Built some of Chicago's early skyscrapers, they put the same attention to detail into this mausoleum that they did into their commercial buildings. The interior was exactly what James had hoped for. Art Deco design elements continued inside, with geometric patterns in the marble floor and stylized metalwork on the crypt facades. The space was smaller than some mausoleums he had photographed, but every element was perfectly proportioned and executed with obvious care. James set up his tripod and began photographing the architectural details. He worked methodically, capturing the interplay of natural light coming through small windows and the artificial light from his portable LED panels. The fog outside created a soft, diffused illumination that enhanced the contemplative mood he was trying to achieve. After an hour of shooting architectural details, James began taking wider shots that showed the mausoleum's interior as a complete space. It was through his camera lens that he first noticed something unusual in several of his shots, particularly those taken toward the back of the mausoleum. James could see what appeared to be figures in the background. At first, he assumed they were reflections or shadows created by his lighting equipment. But as he examined the images on his camera's LCD screen, the figures appeared to be too distinct and too consistently positioned to be explained by lighting effects. James lowered his camera and looked directly at the area where the figures appeared in his photographs. He saw nothing unusual, just the marble crypts and their bronze nameplates, exactly as he would expect. But when he raised the camera again and looked through the viewfinder, the figures were there, standing near the crypts as if posing for a formal portrait. There were 3 of them, 2 men in what appeared to be 1920s business attire, and a woman in a dress of the same era. They stood with the formal posture of people accustomed to having their photographs taken, but their faces were indistinct, as if slightly out of focus even when the rest of the image was sharp. James took several shots, trying different angles and lighting setups. The figures appeared in every photograph, always in the same positions, always with that formal, posed quality. But when he looked at the same areas with his naked eye, he saw nothing. He decided to review his images more carefully. Zooming in on the figures on his camera's LCD screen, James could make out additional details. The men wore suits that were definitely from the 1920s, with high-waisted trousers and narrow lapels. The woman's dress had the dropped waist and knee-length hem typical of flapper fashion. Their clothing and posture suggested they were people of means, which fit with what Mrs. Patterson had told him about the Blackwood family's prominence in Chicago society. James continued photographing, documenting this unusual phenomenon along with the architectural features he had originally come to capture. The figures appeared in every shot that included the back portion of the mausoleum, but were completely absent from photographs taken of the front area near the entrance. As the morning progressed, James began to notice other anomalies in his images. In shots where the figures appeared, the lighting seemed different, softer somehow, with shadows that didn't quite match the light sources he had set up. The figures themselves seemed to be lit by a different light source entirely, one that created a warm, golden illumination around them. James tried different techniques to document what he was seeing. He shot with different lenses, different camera settings, even different cameras, to rule out equipment malfunction. The figures appeared consistently, always in the same positions, always with that formal, dignified bearing. At one point, James decided to take a self-timed photograph that would include himself in the shot, along with the figures. He set up his camera on the tripod, activated the timer function, and positioned himself near the area where the figures appeared. When he reviewed the image, he was startled to see that he appeared to be standing with a group of 5 people, himself and the 4 figures he had been photographing. But in this image, there was a 4th figure that he hadn't seen before, a young boy, perhaps 10 years old, wearing knickers and a white shirt typical of children's clothing from the 1920s. The boy stood slightly apart from the adults, looking directly at the camera with an expression that seemed both solemn and curious. James spent the rest of his scheduled time in the mausoleum taking as many photographs as possible. He varied his approach, shooting both with and without artificial lighting, trying different positions and angles, experimenting with exposure settings and focal lengths. The figures appeared in every relevant shot, sometimes clearly visible, sometimes fainter, but always present. When Mrs. Patterson returned to lock up the mausoleum, James asked her about the Blackwood family members who were interred there. "Let's see," she said, consulting a small notebook she carried. "There's Edward Blackwood, the founder of the construction company. Died in 1924. His wife, Catherine, died in 1926. His business partner, Thomas Mitchell, died in 1925. And there's a child, Edward's grandson, Peter, who died very young in 1923, influenza epidemic." James felt a chill as he realized the description matched exactly what he had been photographing. 2 men, 1 woman, and a young boy, all dressed in clothing appropriate to the 1920s. Did the family have any particular traditions or rituals associated with this mausoleum? James asked. Mrs. Patterson thought for a moment. "Well, they were very formal people, from what I understand, very concerned with proper appearance and behavior. Edward Blackwood was known for insisting that family photographs be taken every year, always in formal dress. They have quite a collection in the cemetery's historical archives." That evening, James spent hours reviewing his photographs on his computer. The figures were even clearer on his large monitor than they had been on his camera's small screen. He could make out details of their clothing, their posture, even subtle expressions on their faces. They appeared to be a family group, posed as if for a formal portrait, exactly as Mrs. Patterson had described their tradition. But Tommy wasn't comfortable with the situation. He felt responsible for the grounds around the mausoleum, and the idea that someone else was working in his assigned area without authorization bothered him professionally. More than that, the mysterious nature of the additional work was starting to make him feel uneasy about spending time alone in the area. Tommy decided to arrive early one Tuesday morning, hoping to catch whoever was responsible for the extra maintenance work. He parked his cart in a location where he could observe the mausoleum grounds without being easily seen, and waited as the sun came up. At approximately 7 a.m., Tommy saw movement near the mausoleum. A figure in what appeared to be work clothes was tending to the flower beds with practiced efficiency. The person moved with the familiarity of someone who knew the gardens well. Working steadily and methodically, Tommy approached quietly, wanting to identify the unauthorized worker and understand how they had gained access to the cemetery. But as he got closer, he began to notice something wrong with what he was seeing. The figure working in the gardens was translucent. Tommy could see the granite wall of the mausoleum through the person's body. The individual was dressed in work clothes that appeared to be from an earlier era, canvas pants held up with suspenders, a collarless shirt, and boots that looked handmade rather than manufactured. Tommy stopped walking and stood perfectly still, watching as the translucent figure continued working. The person was using the antique tools Tommy had found the week before, handling them with obvious familiarity and skill. Each movement was purposeful and efficient, the work of someone who had spent decades perfecting their craft. As Tommy watched, the figure looked up from the flower bed and appeared to notice him. They made eye contact across the distance of perhaps 20 feet, and Tommy saw a face that was weathered by years of outdoor work, but filled with obvious pride and satisfaction in the task at hand. The figure nodded at Tommy, a gesture of acknowledgement between two professionals engaged in the same type of work. Then they returned to their task, completing the flower bed arrangement with a few final adjustments before gathering the antique tools and walking toward the mausoleum. Tommy watched as the figure appeared to enter the granite structure, passing through the solid stone walls as if they were made of mist. Tommy completed his scheduled maintenance that Tuesday, working alongside improvements that had been made with skill far exceeding his own abilities. He found himself treating the grounds around the Morrison Mausoleum with even greater care than before, understanding that he was not the only one who took pride in maintaining this peaceful place. Over the following months, Tommy developed an unspoken partnership with the mysterious gardener. He would perform his assigned maintenance tasks, and additional improvements would appear between his visits. The gardens around the Morrison Mausoleum became the most beautiful in the entire cemetery, a showcase of horticultural artistry that drew compliments from visitors and cemetery staff alike. Tommy never saw the translucent figure again, but he always had the sense that his work was being observed and appreciated. He began leaving small gestures of respect, a cup of coffee placed near the antique tools, seasonal flowers arranged in patterns that he thought might be appreciated by someone who clearly loved gardening. The Morrison Mausoleum remained Tommy's favorite assignment throughout his career at Mount Auburn Cemetery. He understood that some places are tended by those who loved them in life and continue to care for them in death. And sometimes the living and the dead can work together to create something beautiful. Story 5. The Late Shift Doctor. Sarah Martinez had been working as an emergency physician for 8 years when she took on a part-time consulting position with Oakwood Memorial Park, one of the largest cemetery operations in Phoenix, Arizona. The job seemed perfect for someone looking to supplement their income while reducing the high-stress environment of hospital emergency medicine. Her role was to provide medical oversight for the cemetery's crematorium and to be on call for any health emergencies that might occur during funeral services or cemetery operations. The position required her to be available for evening and weekend calls, which fit well with her hospital schedule. The Ramirez family mausoleum at Oakwood Memorial had been the site of several family health emergencies over the years. The elderly patriarch, Don Fernando Ramirez, had suffered a heart episode during his wife's funeral service in 1998. His daughter had fainted during a memorial service in 2003. Most recently, a family member had experienced what appeared to be a panic attack during a 2019 gathering at the mausoleum. When Sarah was called to the mausoleum on a humid August evening, she expected to find another routine medical situation, probably an elderly family member who had been overwhelmed by heat and emotion during a memorial service. Instead, she found something that would challenge her understanding of both medicine and mortality. Sarah arrived at the cemetery at approximately 9 p.m., following directions to the Ramirez Mausoleum from the security guard who had called for medical assistance. The cemetery was closed to general visitors, but family members had special access privileges for evening memorial gatherings. The mausoleum was a beautiful example of Southwestern architecture, built from local stone with iron details that reflected the region's Spanish colonial influence. As Sarah approached the structure, she could see lights inside and hear the soft sound of voices engaged in what sounded like prayer or a conversation. Sarah knocked on the heavy wooden doors and identified herself as the medical consultant responding to an emergency call. A woman in her 50s opened the doors and invited her inside. "Thank you for coming, doctor," the woman said. "I'm Maria Ramirez. We called because my uncle Eduardo has been experiencing some kind of episode. He's been unresponsive for about 20 minutes now, but his vital signs seem stable." Sarah followed Maria into the mausoleum, where she found approximately 15 family members gathered around a man in his 70s who was sitting in a chair near one of the crypts. Eduardo Ramirez appeared to be in a trance-like state, his eyes open but unfocused, his breathing regular but shallow. Sarah knelt beside Eduardo and began her medical assessment. His pulse was steady, his blood pressure normal, and his respiratory rate appropriate for someone at rest. But he was completely unresponsive to verbal commands or physical stimuli, staring straight ahead as if seeing something that no one else could perceive. "How long has your uncle been like this?" Sarah asked Maria. "It started about 30 minutes ago," Maria replied. "We were having a memorial service for my grandfather, Don Fernando, on the anniversary of his death. Uncle Eduardo was talking about childhood memories when he suddenly stopped speaking and became like this." Sarah continued her examination, finding no obvious medical explanation for Eduardo's condition. His pupils were reactive to light, suggesting he wasn't unconscious in the typical sense. His muscle tone was normal, ruling out many neurological causes. Yet he remained completely unresponsive to his surroundings. As Sarah worked, she became aware that the family members were watching her with expressions that seemed to contain more than just medical concern. There was an expectancy in their faces, as if they were waiting for her to recognize something they already understood. "Has your uncle experienced anything like this before?" Sarah asked. Maria exchanged glances with other family members before answering. "Uncle Eduardo has always been sensitive to family gatherings here. He sometimes says he sees people who aren't visible to the rest of us. but this is the first time he's become unresponsive like this. Sarah was preparing to recommend that Eduardo be transported to the hospital for further evaluation when his condition suddenly changed. He blinked several times, looked around the mausoleum as if seeing it for the first time, and focused his attention on Sarah. "Doctor," he said in a voice that was clear and strong, "thank you for coming. But I think I understand now what happened to me." Sarah helped Eduardo to his feet, noting that his coordination and balance appeared completely normal. "Can you tell me what you remember about the last 30 minutes? Eduardo looked around at his family members, then back at Sarah. "I was talking about my childhood, about games my grandfather used to play with me and my cousins. Suddenly, I could see him standing right there." Eduardo pointed to an area near the front of the mausoleum, "looking exactly as he did when I was 8 years old." Eduardo paused, as if deciding how much to share. "He started talking to me, but not with words. It was more like memories being shared directly. He was showing me things from his life that I had never known about. Experiences he'd had during the Mexican Revolution, stories about how he met my grandmother, details about our family history that died with him." Sarah listened carefully, trying to assess whether Eduardo was describing a hallucination, a memory disorder, or something else entirely. But his speech was coherent, his thought processes clear, and his physical presentation suggested complete neurological recovery. "During this experience, were you aware of your family members around you?" Sarah asked. "I could sense they were there, but they seemed very far away. The conversation with my grandfather felt much more immediate, more real than anything else happening in the room." One of the younger family members, a woman in her 30s, spoke up. "Doctor, this kind of thing has been happening in our family for generations. We have stories about family members who could see and communicate with relatives who had passed on, especially here in the mausoleum." Sarah found herself in unfamiliar territory. Her medical training had prepared her to diagnose and treat physiological conditions, but Eduardo's episode didn't fit any standard medical categories. He appeared to have experienced something profound and meaningful, and his family clearly understood it as part of their cultural and spiritual heritage, rather than a medical emergency. "I'd like to recommend that you follow up with your family physician," Sarah told Eduardo, "just to make sure there aren't any underlying health issues that might have contributed to this episode." Eduardo nodded agreement, but added, "Doctor, I want you to know that I don't feel like I experienced a medical problem. I feel like I was given a gift, the opportunity to connect with my grandfather one more time and to learn things about my family that I'll be able to share with future generations." As Sarah prepared to leave the mausoleum, Maria walked her to the doors. "Doctor, can I ask you something? During the time when Uncle Eduardo was unresponsive, did you notice anything unusual about the atmosphere in here?" Sarah considered the question carefully. She had been focused on her medical assessment, but thinking back, she recalled that the temperature in the mausoleum had seemed inconsistent, cooler in some areas, warmer in others, in ways that didn't correspond to the ventilation or the evening air temperature outside. "The temperature seemed to vary in different parts of the room," Sarah admitted. Maria nodded. "We've all noticed that during family gatherings here. It's like different areas of the mausoleum hold different energies, and they respond to what's happening during our memorial services." Sarah left Oakwood Memorial Park that evening with more questions than answers. Eduardo's episode had resolved completely, with no apparent lasting effects. His family understood it as a spiritual experience rather than a medical emergency. Yet Sarah had been called to provide medical intervention for a condition that didn't seem to have a medical basis. Over the following weeks, Sarah found herself researching cases of altered consciousness, that occurred in locations with strong emotional or historical significance. She learned about phenomena that various cultures interpreted as communication with deceased family members, particularly in places where the deceased were laid to rest. Sarah's medical training had taught her to look for physical explanations for health symptoms, but her experience at the Ramirez Mausoleum introduced her to the possibility that some conditions might have origins beyond the purely physiological. She continued her consulting work with Oakwood Memorial Park, and over the months that followed, she was called to several similar situations. Family members experiencing episodes of altered consciousness during memorial gatherings, individuals who reported profound spiritual experiences while visiting deceased relatives, moments when the boundary between life and death seemed temporarily permeable. Sarah learned to approach these situations with medical professionalism while also respecting the cultural and spiritual significance they held for the families involved. She developed protocols for ensuring physical safety while allowing space for experiences that didn't fit conventional medical categories. The Ramirez Mausoleum became a place Sarah visited regularly, not for medical emergencies, but because the family invited her to their memorial gatherings. They had come to see her as someone who understood that healing could take many forms, and that sometimes the most important medicine involved helping families connect with their loved ones across the boundary between life and death. Epilogue. These 5 encounters in mausoleums across America share common themes that challenge our conventional understanding of death and memory. Each witness was someone with professional training and experience, people whose careers required careful observation and analytical thinking. Yet they all encountered phenomena that couldn't be easily explained by standard professional knowledge. What makes these accounts particularly compelling is their subtlety. These weren't dramatic supernatural events involving obvious paranormal activity. Instead, they were quiet moments when the boundary between past and present seemed to blur, when places designed to honor the dead appeared to retain some essence of those they memorialized. Marcus, the security guard, discovered that some places continue to receive care from those who loved them in life. Helena, the preservation specialist, learned that buildings can hold more than just architectural significance. They can preserve the passions and talents of those who inhabited them. James, the photographer, found that art can sometimes capture subjects that exist beyond normal perception. Tommy, the groundskeeper, developed a working partnership with someone who shared his dedication to creating beauty, even across the boundary between life and death. Dr. Martinez learned that healing can take forms that extend beyond medical intervention, encompassing spiritual and cultural dimensions that connect families across generations. These stories remind us that mausoleums are more than just expensive tombstones. They are spaces created with the intention of preserving memory, honoring love, and maintaining connection between the living and the dead. Perhaps it shouldn't surprise us that sometimes those intentions seem to be fulfilled in ways that exceed their creators' expectations. The next time you visit a cemetery and see those marble and granite monuments rising above the landscape, remember that they represent more than just wealth or architectural ambition. They are expressions of the human desire to create permanence in the face of mortality, to build something beautiful that will outlast our own brief time on Earth. And sometimes, if the stories shared here have any truth to them, those monuments succeed in ways their builders never imagined, not just preserving memory, but preserving something more essential, something that continues to care for these places and the people who visit them with respect and understanding. In the end, these mausoleum encounters suggest that death might not be the absolute ending we often assume it to be. Instead, it might be a transformation, a movement from one form of existence to another, with some essence remaining connected to the places and people that mattered most in life. Whether you interpret these accounts as evidence of life after death, as manifestations of powerful human emotions and memories, or simply as stories that help us process our own fears and hopes about mortality, they offer something valuable, a reminder that love, creativity, and dedication can leave marks on the world that persist far beyond the physical presence of those who created them. The mausoleums stand as monuments not just to the dead, but to the enduring power of human connection and the mysterious ways that connection can manifest itself in the world of the living. A huge thank you to everyone who stayed with me until the very end. Your presence makes this journey into the unknown feel a little less lonely, and I'm really grateful you chose to spend your evening here. I hope these stories gave you exactly what you were looking for, the perfect mix of fear and fascination. There's something special about how we can all come together in the darkness, united by our love for a good scare. I truly hope tonight's tales hit you just as hard as they did me. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like it and subscribe to the channel for more creepy content. Your support helps me keep bringing these stories to life. And I'd love for you to be back tomorrow night when I share more mysteries and chills. Until then, sleep tight, dream sweetly, and don't let tonight's stories creep into your dreams. But if they do, just remember they're only stories. Sweet dreams, my friend. See you tomorrow night.